In the great spiritual writer C.S. Lewis' book called The Great Divorce, he spends time describing not earthly divorce as we know it, but the separation between God and God's people, understood perhaps as heaven and hell, and how we move from one to the other. He describes an experience of this ultimate reality of God's presence. And I quote from him, "It was the light, the grass, the trees that were different, made of some different substance, so much solider than things in our country that men were ghosts by comparison. Walking proved difficult, the grass hard as diamonds to my unsubstantial feet, made me feel as if I were walking on wrinkled rock, and I suffered pains like those of the mermaid in Hans Andersen. The mermaid, of course, of The Little Mermaid, who, after she trades in her tail and life in the sea for legs on dry land, she perceives every step she takes on dry ground as daggers into those feet." Lewis is describing the narrator of the novel's first moments in what we might call the outer courts of heaven. Upon arriving on a bus, that's how they get from one to the other, arriving on this bus from purgatory or hell, depending upon one's perspective, the main character finds heaven to be painful. Not because of some punishment that awaits him there, but because he has never encountered somewhere so real. The grass is so profoundly vivid and true that his uninitiated body simply cannot bear to feel it under his feet. As the novel proceeds, we learn that the fellow travelers on the bus all perceive heaven in the same way. These heavenly beings come from across the mountains or across the cloud bank, we don't know which it is, and these heavenly beings who are incredibly heavy and yet light and light-giving at the same time come from across the mountains and come to meet these bus riders and help them into the absolute reality of God's presence back across the mountains. They're there as guides. In order to be able to go with these beings back across the mountains, each person must give up something. Give up something that he or she holds on to dearly. Even after death, they're still holding on to it. Whether it's bitterness, vice, pride, each person learns that the only way to stay is to give up what holds them back. It's not easy at all. Giving up on these obstacles to staying means, for these bus riders, giving away their very selves. Because these attributes that hold them back, these obstacles, are probably the most true way of describing who they are. So to give it up is to completely give themselves up. And some are unable to do so. And they get back on the bus and they return to that intermediary place, comfortable in the shadow world that it is. Yet time after time they have the opportunity to get back on that bus and to take that trip back up into the outer courts of heaven, perhaps staying a little longer with each visit, releasing their souls to grow a bit more into that reality that goes beyond all reality. And those visitors come to meet them each time, drawing out of those bus riders what needs to be abandoned, chipping away until there is only the naked, loved soul laden with the fruits of forgiveness, who is then able to enter in to God's very presence across those mountains. The process of pruning the soul is unpleasant. Yet the process of pruning the soul is unavoidable. Even the most fruitful of souls remains in need of cutting back. Without regular thinning, even the most luscious of branches, the most holy of God's people, begins to plateau in its fruit production, as it were. Jesus tells his disciples that he is the true vine, through whom true life flows to all the branches. Those who believe in him and follow him are the branches. God the Father is the vine grower who tends the branches, thinning out where the foliage has become too thick and the fruit production has slowed, pruning out the dead and unproductive wood, cutting back the spindly branches that do grow fruit, but by cutting them off forces them to thicken up, to bear even more fruit. This pruning process can be terrifying for us. Like the characters in The Great Divorce who refuse to part with those pieces of themselves that impede their entrance into heaven. We too may fear letting go of parts of ourselves, especially the parts that seem to be bearing fruit. The coming of the vine dresser, meant to be life-giving and joy-filled, may elicit from us instead fear and anger and anxiety. Martin Luther wrote, "But God is not a tyrant. He is a pious vine dresser who tends and works his vineyard with all faithfulness and diligence, and surely does not intend to ruin it. He does not let his vineyard stand there to be torn to pieces by dogs and wild sows. He tends it and watches over it. He is concerned that it bear well and produce good wine. Therefore, he must hoe and prune, so as not to chop and cut too deeply into the stem and the roots, take off too many branches, or trim off all the foliage. Let us be unafraid. In perfect love there is no fear," we hear in the epistle. Let us not be afraid. Let us not be terrified by the prongs and teeth of the devil in the world, for God will not let them go beyond what serves our best interests. Like Luther, I do not believe that God sends troubles into our lives in order to prune us. But I do believe that God takes the troubles of this world, the prongs and teeth of the devil in the world, as Luther says, and uses them for our good if we allow it. As a seminarian, I had to take a series of, Sarah did too when she was there, courses on church music. And in my first year, in my first class, I sat there bored out of my brain as the professor explained the difference between whole and half notes. I have a degree in music, you see. I grew up in a boy choir, traveling the world, singing the great repertoire of the church. Whole and half notes, my foot. I tried my hardest to get out of those classes. They did let me do a little bit of independent study and some things that interested me, but they didn't let me off the hook completely. I still had to sit through several entry-level courses. I resented it. I would sit there embittered against the teacher and the institution that forced her upon me in that moment. God did not send those courses into my life. They were part of the normal curriculum for every seminarian. But God took those courses and used them to pry away from me some of my overinflated view of myself. As it turned out, I had a lot to learn. To my great astonishment, I did not know everything there was to know about church music. I was humbled, and out of that humbling, I grew an appreciation of styles of music that before I never would have taken seriously. I learned to point the text of the service so that we can sing them as we do even to this day. I was cut back, and hopefully because of it, I have borne more fruit. I can imagine, I know, that each of us has at least one story like that in which we have been pruned, and I hope you'll share them with each other at coffee hour today. Life is full of growth and pruning and growth again. As one commentator put it, our goal is not merely to just hang on to the vine, but to bear fruit, and more of it at that, drawing our life and our sustenance from the vine to which we remain attached. And so when you leave here today and you go home to your gorgeous sunny afternoon and you cut the grass or you work in your own garden, remember that your own pruning could be just around the corner. Let go of that then, that slows your spiritual growth. And with those characters in the Great Divorce, take one more timid step out into the verdant reality of God, that verdant reality that so far surpasses what we can ask or imagine, that it is hard at times to bear. Take one more timid step out into that grass, and I promise you, with each step, it will hurt your feet a little less than the time before.